This is how to make a metal selfie. Take a picture of yourself and open it in Photoshop. Then go to Image, Adjustments, Threshold. This is going to open a window with a slider that you can adjust the contrast of your image. You need to end up with an image where either all of the white parts are touching or all of the black parts are touching, because you're going to need a continuous line image in order to have a continuous piece of metal to cut. Each image is going to be different, so it's up to you how you decide to do this, but you want to just make an image that you're happy with. The size of your image should be about 4 inches tall. Once you're happy, go ahead and print it out. The image on the left is an example of a selfie with all the white parts touching, and the image on the right is an example of a selfie with all the black parts touching. The one with all the white touching needs some sort of shape for the background, and it's going to work better on a lighter colored metal like brass or nickel. The image with all of the black parts touching is going to work better on a metal that can be darkened, like copper. Clean your metal with either sandpaper or a Scotch-Brite pad, and then adhere your selfie to the metal using rubber cement. Make sure you let the rubber cement dry for as long as you can before you start cutting. I put my selfies on fairly large pieces of metal, so the first thing I'm going to do is just cut them out of the bigger sheet. Notice I have to go from both sides in order to get my jeweler saw around such a large piece of metal. When I'm cutting the selfie that has all the white parts touching, I want to actually cut out my silhouette shape first. So in my case, this is an oval. On the selfie with all the black parts touching, it really didn't matter. I just wanted to cut out just a smaller sheet of metal. Once you have your rough shape cut out, you're going to need to drill the holes so that you can do your piercing. On the selfie with all of the black parts touching, this means you're going to cut away the white. So everywhere I'm making a little mark is where I'm going to drill a hole. On the selfie with all the black parts touching, I'm eventually going to cut away the whole background as well, but it's better to do that after you've pierced the inside. Now I've started drilling the holes on the little areas where I've marked. So there's going to be a hole in each area where I have white space. I'm going to speed this up, but it is important that you take your time and drill your holes carefully. You also may have to get a smaller drill bit to reach some of the really small areas, such as the whites of your eyes and other small details. Be careful as you're drilling to stay completely within the white area that you want to cut away. If your selfie was made with all the white parts touching, you're going to drill holes in all of the black areas, and you're going to be cutting that away. So everywhere I'm pointing with the pencil here is where I'm going to put a drill hole. Use as small of a drill bit as you need to in order to stay in the black spaces as you drill. And again, do this carefully because you need to be pretty precise with this project. It's also really important that you're clear about whether or not you're cutting away the black areas or the white areas. After you've drilled your holes, it's time to start cutting out your negative spaces. I'm starting on the selfie with all of the black parts touching. I think it's a good idea to start cutting your negative space from the center and work your way out. That way you have a nice large piece of metal to hold on to as you cut all of your precise details. As you're piercing your selfie, take your time and be really careful. You want to get as much detail as possible so that it really looks like you when you're finished. A lot of the tiny details like eyelashes and small wrinkles are going to be too small to go back in with a file, so you want to be really careful with your jeweler saw and get all of that detail. I'm going to speed up this video to make this go quicker, but make sure when you're actually doing your piercing that you take your time. Another reason to be careful as you're piercing your selfie is that sometimes there'll be very small areas connecting all of the black parts or all of the white parts to each other. And so you want to be careful not to let your metal bend as you cut it. Try to prevent that bending by supporting your work on the V of the bench pen as much as possible. I'm about to cut out this piece of metal around my eye, and I'm going to show you what you should do if you do find that your metal has bent a little bit. Be really careful not to bend little pieces back and forth, but if you do need to make a correction, put your piece on a steel block and tap it flat with a mallet. Continue piercing your piece carefully until you've removed all of the white parts. The video is obviously sped up here, but I would say this probably took me about an hour to get all of the negative space pierced out from my selfie. As you're piercing these, they can look really abstract and weird, but if you hold it up against a light background, you can see that you're on the right track. Once you've cut away all the negative space from inside your selfie, and on the selfie with all the black parts touching, that means cutting away all the white parts. Now you'll be ready to pierce away all of the background from your image. Once you've finished piercing out your piece, you can go ahead and remove the paper that you rubber cemented on. Now that the paper is removed, you'll be able to see your metal with even more detail. And you can go in and make minor corrections using your jeweler's saw blade as a tiny file. So just thread your saw blade back through some of the negative space that you pierced out and carefully go in and saw into lines that you want to refine or make more crisp or just add a little bit more detail. I find this can be especially useful in areas like hair where it's just easier to see the very precise level of detail once that paper is removed. If your selfie has all the white parts touching, you're going to be cutting away the black areas. Just like in the first piece that we cut, I recommend cutting from the middle and working your way out to the edges. So here I'm starting with some of the interior piercing, and I'm just cutting away all the black parts, again being really careful to preserve as much level of detail as possible. And even though this video is sped up, in real life I'm really taking my time and trying to get as much detail as I can. It's important to be really careful as you're piercing this selfie not to let the metal bend or break. Sometimes when you've created your continuous line image, in this case where all of the white parts are touching, you can end up with really thin areas that are connecting your piece together. And it's really important that you don't let those bend or, in the worst case scenario, break. In order to prevent that, the best thing to do is really keep your piece supported on the V of the bench pen as you work, and that's going to help keep your piece from bending around on you. If you're working on a selfie with all of the white parts touching, as soon as you've cut away all of the black areas, you'll be done since you cut your initial shape at the beginning. Go ahead and peel your paper off. Once the paper's peeled off, you can see your metal a little bit more accurately, and you can go in and make the details a little bit more crisp and add some little details using your jeweler's saw like a tiny file. I'm adding a little bit of detail in the hair in this piece, and I can go in and make corners a little bit more crisp and just kind of clean things up. you're not going to be able to fit a real file in these areas, so you can use your jeweler saw as a file. Now that your top piece of metal is done, it's time to go ahead and make the back piece. For the selfie with all the white parts touching, I just traced it onto a piece of copper. And for the selfie with all of the black parts touching, you can kind of make whatever shape you want. I'm just doing an oval to keep things simple. Go ahead and use your jeweler saw to cut out those back pieces. So I would use copper on the back of the piece with brass on the front, and I would recommend using brass on the piece with copper on the front. Although if you have access to other metals and other colors, you could use whatever you like. Once those are cut out, I'm going to use a file to refine the edges a little bit. This way you can fix any mistakes that you made or just make things a little bit cleaner. You can use the file to remove the marks from your saw, and you can even go in with a bit of sandpaper and then clean up those file marks. The next thing I recommend doing is sanding off the pieces that you've pierced. So I'm using a piece of 400 grit sandpaper on a sanding stick to just sand off the surface of those pieces that I pierced. It's removing any little scratches and discolorations and just kind of making the surface as uniform as possible. Here I'm doing the same thing to the piece of brass that I pierced. I'm just using a piece of 400 grit sandpaper on a sanding stick to sand out the surface and remove any scratches or marks and just make everything a little bit more uniform. Now we need to prepare these pieces for riveting. What I'm doing here is deciding where I'm going to put my rivets. I want to put probably 4 on a piece of this scale. You could put more if you want, but I think 4 is probably the minimum that you should have in order to have a really nice connection. So I'm just marking with a Sharpie where I'm going to drill the holes on my top piece of metal. I'm preparing this one for rivets as well. So again, I recommend putting probably 4 rivets at minimum on a piece of this size, but you could definitely put more if you want, and I'm just marking with a Sharpie where I want to drill my holes. I'm using a size 55 drill bit to drill the holes into my top sheet. A size 55 drill bit is going to match the size 16 gauge wire I plan to use for my rivets. After I drilled my holes on the top sheet, I carefully lined up the back sheet and drilled holes through it as well. I'm again using a size 55 drill bit, which is going to match the 16 gauge wire I plan to use for the rivets on this piece. I'm drilling all the holes on the top sheet first, and I want to show you a way to clean off the little burr that happens on the back of your metal when you drill a hole. If you just take a bigger size drill bit, you place it in that hole and twist it, it's going to rip that little burr off. And this is a really quick way to remove that burr, and it's really important because as we start riveting, you don't want that little piece of metal in your way. It's going to create a little bit of a gap between your layers, which you don't want. Now I'm going to use a length of wire to hold my metal together so that I can line up my top piece and my bottom piece. This can be tricky because these pieces of metal aren't the same size. So I have a piece of wire going all the way through my first 2 holes as I'm drilling my second hole through the bottom sheet. Then I can feed another piece of wire through both of those holes. So if you see, I have 2 pieces of wire holding this together, so now it's really secure, and these are just temporary pieces of wire. Now I can go back in and I can drill all the way through the bottom sheet, and I'm just drilling through the first hole I drilled, and it's going to stay really lined up. Now I can drill my 4th and final hole, but I could do as many as I want at this point with the 2 pieces of wire holding everything together, and it's all going to stay lined up. After you've drilled as many holes as you wanted to through those top and bottom sheets, you can go ahead and take that wire out. I recommend, again, going in with that big drill bit and ripping off the burr from the back of the holes that you just drilled. That's going to prevent that little bit of metal from getting in your way as you rivet. I like using this drill bit because if you were to use a sandpaper or a file to do this, you're going to scuff up the metal that you already cleaned. Now we're going to patina our copper black in order to create a lot of contrast between our copper and brass layers. The first step to patina is to clean your piece really thoroughly, so I'm using a Scotch-Brite pad to scrub it off. I'm using liver of sulfur, which comes in a variety of formats, but I have the little rock form, and I'm going to just add hot water to that little small rock, and it's going to smell like rotten eggs. And then I'm just going to stir that up a little bit to get it to dissolve in the warm water. And I can put my clean piece of metal in, and you can see it starts to change color really quickly. Just drop your piece in the patina and let it sit there for a few minutes and watch it darken. You're going to want to prepare a brass brush with a little bit of dish soap to lubricate it. And after you notice that your piece has started to get darker, you're going to take it out and rinse it off in the sink. And then you're going to use that brass brush to burnish the surface. So it might look like a little bit of the patina is coming off at this point, but that's fine. You just want to brass brush the whole thing and then put it back into the patina for a few more minutes. I usually dip my piece about 3 times in the liver of sulfur patina to build up a nice black surface. If my patina solution is older, it might take a little bit longer, but a fresh hot patina usually only takes a few minutes for each dip. So hopefully you can see how that piece of metal is changing color. Sometimes it'll look a little bit rainbowy. You just want to leave it in a little bit longer if you see that kind of iridescent surface. It's important you don't leave your piece in the liver of sulfur for too long, or it's going to build up a really thick and crusty layer that's just going to flake off. So when you do your patina, you just want to stand there and kind of watch it change in the solution and be ready to take it out relatively quickly so that you don't build up that thick, crusty layer. After the 3rd time your piece has been in the solution, you can take it out and rinse it, and it's really important that you don't forget to brass brush on that last step. If you forget to brass brush, your piece is going to end up being kind of powdery, and the patina is going to want to wipe off on your fingers. So it's really critical that that last time you take it out, you use the brass brush with soap to really burnish the whole surface and get a nice shiny black finish over the whole piece. Once you rinse your piece off, you can use a paper towel to dry off the water. And I think it's pretty important that you hold your piece only by the edges. You don't want to get fingerprints on that patinaed surface, so be a little bit careful with it at this stage. Once it's dry, you may decide to seal that patinaed surface with something like Renaissance wax or a spray lacquer, and that's just going to keep that base metal from fingerprinting as it's handled. You may also decide to put a Renaissance wax or another type of seal on your base piece. I'm just going to put these 2 pieces together, the patinaed copper on top and the brass on the bottom, so you can see what a nice contrast you can get with these 2 pieces. If your base piece was copper and your top piercing was brass, you're going to want to go ahead and patina that piece of copper using the same steps we just followed. After you've patinaed, your last step is to rivet the 2 layers together. So here I'm filing the end of my piece of 16 gauge wire so that it's flat, and I'm going to feed that through the back of the 2 layers of my piece. And I want to leave a small amount of metal on the top. Go ahead and use wire cutters to cut off the same amount of metal from the back. So you want to have about 1 millimeter or so sticking out on either side. Now, because you use your wire cutters, you do need to file the back of that piece of wire flat too. So just be really careful you don't scuff up your piece when you do this. Because I used the right size drill bit with the right gauge of wire, my wire's in there fairly snugly, which is helpful, but I do like to keep my finger on the wire to hold it where I want it so that it doesn't slip out as I'm filing or getting this piece fitted. Here's an up-close side view of that piece of wire before it's been riveted so that you can see how much metal is sticking out on either side. Now I'm going to place my piece on a steel block, and I'm going to use a riveting hammer to just tap that wire, and it's going to flare on either side and hold my pieces together. I like to tap gently from both sides in order to keep it even on the front and the back. Here's a side view as I do the second rivet on this piece. Notice if you were to put your piece flat against that bench block, how your rivet wire would push all the way to the top. It's important that you keep that equal amount of wire sticking out on both sides. So when you put your piece down to rivet, try and hover it off of that bench block just a little bit as you start to hammer so that you maintain an equal amount of wire on each side of your rivet. It doesn't take much force with the riveting hammer to get that metal to flare, and I do like to hammer a little bit from both sides to get it to flare as evenly as possible. I'm just going to go through those steps 2 more times to get the other 2 rivets in. So I file my wire flat, feed it through from the back, leave about 1 millimeter or so sticking out on the front, and then cut that same amount of wire from the back, file that end flat, put the piece down on the bench pen, and tap with the riveting hammer from both sides. This looks really easy because it is really easy. It takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of riveting, but it's actually pretty simple. You can get a lot more complicated with rivets too. These are just really simple, so you don't want to try and flatten them out or do anything really other than what I'm showing you here, because these are just a very simple standard rivet where the metal is flared out on either side and holds it in, but they're not intended to be flush or decorative in any way. Once you have all 4 rivets in on this piece is finished. We're going to follow the exact same steps to rivet this piece together. So first I'm filing the end of my wire flat, and I'm going to feed it through from the back. And sometimes this can be a little bit challenging because you did drill your hole to fit the wire as tightly as possible. So just kind of wiggle it through, and then you want to leave about 1 millimeter on each side. So cut off the extra, carefully file the back flat without scratching up your whole piece. Put it down on the bench pen so that there is an equal amount of wire sticking out on either side. And then give a few gentle taps with the riveting hammer. Just a reminder again that these are just standard rivets and they're meant to stick out a bit on either side of the metal. They're not meant to be flush or decorative in any way. You can definitely get a lot more complicated with your riveting, but we're going to save that for a future project. I'm just going to repeat these steps for each rivet on this piece, and it's going to be complete. And here are the finished selfies. We've covered sawing, piercing, filing, sanding, patina, and riveting. I can't wait to see what you come up with.